Only U.S. citizens can vote in federal elections. That part isn't debated. What is debated is whether voters should have to prove it. If eligibility is limited to citizens, how do you actually verify that? And if verification becomes a barrier, what happens to the right itself? That's the tension. Federal elections in the United States are limited to citizens. That part is clear. But the Constitution leaves most of the mechanics, the procedures, to the states. Today, when Americans register to vote, they typically affirm that they are citizens, under penalty of perjury. In many states, that sworn affirmation is the primary safeguard, and that's where the debate begins. Is affirmation enough? Or should documentary proof, a passport, a birth certificate, be required before casting a ballot in a federal election? Supporters of proof argue that eligibility without verification weakens enforcement and public confidence. Opponents argue that adding documentation risks creating barriers for eligible voters. A democracy can declare its rules. The harder question is whether it can enforce them. Before we argue policy, we need to clarify something. What does the Constitution actually say about voting? It doesn't grant a broad, universal right in one single clause. Instead, it limits who cannot be denied the vote. And it leaves much of the structure to the states. That matters. The Constitution does not contain a single sweeping sentence that says all citizens have the right to vote. Instead, several amendments prohibit denying the vote on specific grounds: race, sex, failure to pay a poll tax, age for those over 18. In other words, the Constitution protects access by preventing exclusion, but it does not detail how eligibility must be verified. Under federal law, only citizens may vote in federal elections. However, the mechanics, registration procedures, identification rules, documentation requirements are largely left to individual states. That division of authority is central to this debate, because when questions arise about proof of citizenship, they intersect with both federal eligibility rules and state administrative power. If eligibility is limited to citizens, enforcement becomes the next question, because a rule that cannot be verified is difficult to uphold. Supporters of proof argue that citizenship isn't just a qualification, it's a requirement. And requirements, by definition, must be enforceable. That's their case. Supporters of proof begin with a simple premise: federal elections are limited to citizens. If that rule exists, they argue, there must be a mechanism to confirm it. Without verification, eligibility becomes symbolic rather than operational. They point out that many civic systems already require documentation: passports, jury service, certain public benefits. In those cases, documentation is not considered extraordinary. It is procedural. From this perspective, requiring proof of citizenship is not about suspicion. It is about administrative consistency. Some also argue that public confidence in elections depends not only on actual integrity, but on visible safeguards. In their view, verification reinforces legitimacy, and legitimacy reinforces stability. But enforcement isn't the only concern. Critics of documentation requirements argue that verification can create friction, and friction in a voting system has consequences. They point out that not every eligible citizen has easy access to official documents. Birth certificates get lost, names change. Records aren't always simple. Their concern isn't about eligibility. It's about access. That's their argument. Opponents of strict documentation requirements begin with a different premise. They argue that documented cases of non-citizen voting in federal elections are statistically rare. From their perspective, adding new proof requirements addresses a problem that is already limited, but their primary concern goes further. They argue that documentation is not uniformly accessible. Some citizens do not have readily available birth certificates. Some have name changes due to marriage or adoption. Some were born in rural areas or decades ago when record keeping was less standardized. In those cases, verification may require time, fees, or bureaucratic navigation. And even small obstacles, they argue, can affect participation. In their view, the risk is not widespread fraud. It is unintended exclusion. Maybe this debate isn't only about enforcement or documentation. Maybe it's about confidence. Because in a democracy, perception matters almost as much as procedure. Some Americans worry about eligibility being verified. Others worry about access being restricted. Both concerns point to the same thing: trust. That's where the tension shifts. Public trust in elections is not measured only by statistics. It is shaped by perception. Supporters of documentation argue that visible safeguards strengthen confidence in outcomes. If voters believe eligibility rules are enforced, they are more likely to accept results. Opponents argue that participation itself builds trust. When access feels simple and inclusive, legitimacy grows from engagement. In this view, adding friction, even with good intentions, can undermine confidence among those who feel burdened. So the debate becomes less about numbers and more about institutional design. Should trust be reinforced primarily through verification or through accessibility? Because both approaches aim at the same goal: stability. In a constitutional republic, rights must be protected. But eligibility must also be enforceable. Those two principles don't always sit comfortably together. The debate over proof of citizenship isn't just about documents. It's about how a nation balances access and enforcement. That balance is not automatic. It's designed. And design choices have consequences. The Constitution limits federal voting to citizens. That principle is clear. The disagreement lies in implementation. How much verification is necessary to uphold eligibility? And how much friction is acceptable before access is compromised? There is no purely technical answer. Every system reflects trade-offs. Prioritize enforcement too heavily, and participation may decline. Prioritize access without verification, and some will question legitimacy. In that sense, the debate is not about choosing between integrity and inclusion. It is about calibrating both, and calibration requires judgment, not slogans, not assumptions, but design. Because in the end, democratic stability depends not only on who votes, but on whether citizens believe the system is fair. That is the enduring question. Where should the line be drawn? Tell us your reasoning, not your reaction. Opposition point. Subscribe for structured debate.